Illinois, mid-19th century politics and the Civil War, part. Illinois was really coming of age in the 1840s and 1850s. Through a plan developed by Governor Thomas Ford, the state was able to pay off a substantial portion of its public debt due to the problems associated with the railroad and canal projects. Ford increased property taxes at a rate that would go up with economic prosperity in the state. And by the late 1850s, Illinois was able to pay its annual interest on the debt, and 20 years later, it paid off the debt in full. In 1846, Congress declared war on Mexico, beginning the Mexican-American War, which will last until 1848. And Congress requested states to supply troops for the fight. Illinois was asked to supply 3 regiments, but volunteers in the state filled 9. Illinois troops fought in one of the most important engagements of the war, and that was the Battle of Buena Vista. And here's a map of the conflict. And Buena Vista there is, let's see, so it's close to the Gulf of Mexico, and so just inland and then to the north of Mexico City. And that was one of the major battles that Illinois troops participated in under the command of General Zachary Taylor. They defeated Santana's army and his army in northern Mexico. And somehow along the lines, Illinois soldiers got a hold of one of Santana's wooden legs and brought it back to Springfield, and it still is there to this very day. In the late 1830s, the upstate counties were growing faster than the southern counties in the state, and people living there wanted a more centrally located capital. The General Assembly decided to move to another city. There were several cities that competed for that honor, and Springfield won out because it had a building site and it also had $50,000 that was willing to pledge to create the new state capital there. And so in 1839, the state began to send its property to Springfield. And here's a map that gives you an idea of some of the county growth from 1850 to 1860, and then a more centrally located Springfield there in the center part of the state is going to be the new capital, which is the capital in present day Illinois. By 1848, the population of Illinois had risen to 400,000, and the society just become so complex that the Constitution of 1818 just seemed inadequate. So voters elected 162 delegates to a constitutional convention that lasted from June 7 to August 31st in 1847. There were more Democrats than Whigs at the convention, but pro-business Democrats teamed up with Whigs on a variety of issues. One of the first changes in the new Constitution was to limit the number of Supreme Court justices to 3, and to stipulate that they needed to be elected for a 9-year term from different geographic regions. This was an effort to prevent the legislature from packing the court. Also, the Council of Revision was abolished in order to restrict the power of the court and to strengthen the power of the governor. But the governor's veto could be overridden by a simple majority vote. The length of the legislative session was curtailed to less than 40 days per session, and pay was reduced from $2 per day to $1 per day. Public projects were also constrained after the fiasco of the 1830s and 1840s, and now public projects costing over $50,000 had to be approved by voters. The biggest arguments involved banking. Whigs wanted to incorporate provisions which would be favorable to the organization of banks, and Democratic opposition started to soften a little bit. And so a compromise was worked out prohibiting state banks, but permitted the legislature to establish corporations with banking powers, provided the law was approved by the voters at the next election. The Whig pro-business coalition insisted that only citizens could vote, and that argument won out over the Democratic effort to keep the 1818 provision, which just simply allowed any white male inhabitant over the age of 21 to be able to vote. So this was to make sure that only citizens, and at this time, states determined who a citizen was and who a citizen wasn't. So this basically was making sure that only Illinois citizens 21 years and older could vote. There was an effort by a northern delegate to allow African American men to vote, but that failed by a large margin. So this was only white men, citizens over the age of 21 in the state could vote. The new Constitution also provided for a property tax that could support the state government. And the Whigs wanted to add a poll tax from 50 cents to $1 to be paid by all people between the ages of 21 and 60 who are eligible to vote. The poll tax was to ensure that non-property owners bear part of the tax burden. And the new constitution also fixed a number of salaries for state officials at relatively low rates. So this was kind of a relatively, I don't want to say anti-government, but to really constrain government in terms of how often the legislature could meet, also constraining certain elements of the power of the governor, strengthening it in some ways, but still restricting it, and also restricting banking. And as you're reading in your textbook, banking is a major issue in the 1830s, with Democrats being very hostile to banks, while Whigs are very pro-bank. Um, Also, to amend the constitution of the state, they relaxed some of the provisions so that if the legislature passed a particular law to amend the constitution, it would have to go to the voters to vote on it. So you didn't have to have a constitutional convention to change the provisions within the constitution. And the constitution was ratified by voters, and about 3/4 of men who were able to vote actually voted. Relating to political changes in Illinois was the issue of public education. Before 1855, less than 1/3 of children in Illinois actually attended school. Some families could afford to send their children to private schools, but many families of the middling sort, working class and poor, could not do so. A few communities did establish free elementary schools before any laws compelled them to do so, and Chicago may have been the first by opening up an elementary school in 1834. During the 1840s, education conventions uh, took place in the state, and they were attended by teachers, by school and government officials, and parents. And they tried to put a lot of pressure on the General Assembly to deal with the issue of public education in the state. And so finally, the General Assembly passed laws in 1841 and again in 1845, permitting local school districts to levy taxes for education. They weren't forced to do so, so many simply did not. In 1854, the General Assembly listened to pleas from the Illinois State Teachers Association, which was founded in 1853, to establish a state superintendent of education, which would be an elected position. In 1855, the General Assembly passed a law based on the principle that the state could use its taxing power to support local schools. Now that they were assured of state funds, dozens of rural communities built one-room schoolhouses, and some larger communities began to develop graded schools. Education beyond the elementary level, though, was another matter. There was a number of private academies and seminaries that existed, but free public high schools did not exist. In the 1850s, some northern counties, though, began to move towards establishing high schools, and Chicago established one in 1856. In rural areas where most people lived, there were simply not enough people to provide a tax base that was large enough to support a high school. Also, high schools weren't necessarily something that farmers wanted to send their kids to, or working class people wanted to send their kids to. This is something that more well-off people would send their kids to high school. In the 1850s, close to 20 private colleges did exist, and they were all sponsored by various religious denominations, but there was no state-funded institutions of higher learning. Charles Hovey, who was an organizer for the Illinois State Teachers Association, he lobbied the General Assembly that elementary education could not improve until teachers received better training. So in 1857, the General Assembly passed a bill creating the Illinois State Normal School, located in Bloomington. The new institution was the first tax-supported college in the state, and also the first teachers college in the Mississippi River Valley. It would later become Illinois State University. By 1900, the building of 4 more normal schools had been authorized, one in Southern Illinois and Carbondale, another one in Eastern, it was Charleston and Eastern was the name of it, and then Northern at DeKalb, and then Western at Macomb. And so this would be Southern Illinois Normal School was 1869, Eastern established in 1895, DeKalb was also established in 1895, and then Western was established in 1899. All 5 of these normal schools started off as teacher training institutions and eventually became full-fledged universities. As you know, Lincoln was born in Kentucky, but migrated west to settle in New Salem, Illinois. And as a young man, this would have been 1831, so he'd be in his early 20s. Lincoln ran for state House of Representatives in 1832 and lost. He ran again in 34, and this time he won. Meanwhile, he was studying law on his own, and in 1836 was admitted to the bar. Now, Lincoln was a Whig, and he entered national politics when he was elected to the U.S. House of Representatives in 1846 and then served his 1847-1849 term. Now, he opposed the Mexican-American War, arguing that it was an illegal war, basically an act of aggression against Mexico. And this is a photograph of a young Abraham Lincoln. Now, he's going to enter his spot resolutions in the House of Representatives, and basically asking where American blood had been shed. And so that was, let me put up that war map real quick here. So if you can see here, if you look at Texas, you can see the Nueces River, and there's also the Rio Grande. With the Nueces River, by a number of treaties, also with the old state of Mexico, the old state of Texas in Mexico, the Nueces River was the southern boundary of that what now renegade state, but then also the northern boundary of Mexico and with the United States. Well, the fighting that takes place and the outbreak of the Mexican-American War is actually south of that river. And so Lincoln's spot resolutions was basically to ask if any of the people living there in this region thought of themselves as Americans, did any of them pay taxes, did anyone vote? And of course, the answer to all of that is no. And so he's basically just trying to argue that the United States has acted in an aggressive way against Mexico, taking a bunch of its territory. Now, despite Lincoln's convictions, this was not popular back in Illinois. The war was extremely popular in Illinois, and Lincoln decided not to run for re-election. Now, in the early 1850s, the Whig Party was basically collapsing. It had difficulty winning national offices. It fractured over the war. In 1854, the remnants of the Whig Party, the Free Soilers, which was a party that was against the expansion of slavery into Western territories, and then the abolitionist members of the Liberty Party, and then some anti-slavery Democrats moved to form the Republican Party. The first use of the Republican name in Illinois came in 1854 when a group of abolitionists from northern counties held a convention in Springfield. Lincoln, who was a Senate hopeful in that year, did not want to be classified as an extremist, so he avoided public association with the new Republican Party, even though he was offered a seat on the Central Committee, but he refused it. In that year, he ran as a Whig, even though the party was collapsing, and he actually had been elected to the state legislature, but resigned so he could campaign for the U.S. Senate, but he lost that election. By 1856, the name of the party became clear, the Republican Party, and by Northern standards, it was really a moderate party, and eventually Lincoln decided to cast his lot with the Republicans. Now, despite Lincoln's loss of election and the demise of his original party, he was a contender for the Senate seat in 1858 that was held by Stephen Douglas. So Douglas was going up for re-election in 1858. And Douglas had been in politics for a very long time. I mentioned him back with in the issues surrounding the Mormon controversy. He was senator during the Mexican-American War and also voted for the Wilmot Proviso, which stipulated that slavery could not be permitted in the new territories acquired from Mexico during the war. However, Douglas, for his own personal gain and also for his state, backed the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which was passed in 1854. And this opened up land for north of the 3630 line, which is part of the Missouri Compromise, into that territory. I'll put up a map here to show you the Nebraska and Kansas-Nebraska. So what the Kansas and Nebraska territories was actually one unorganized territory. And so what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it breaks that unorganized territory into two, one a Nebraska territory and one a Kansas territory. And then also something that Stephen Douglas backs, and that is the concept of popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty just basically argues that the people of the region, when they form as a territory and then they move to form themselves as a state, they can determine whether they want to have slavery or not. But this really does, though, throw out the Missouri Compromise. And if I put that map up again, and that Missouri Compromise line, if you can see the unorganized territory, this is what's eventually going to be um, Oklahoma, and then the bottom border of Missouri. North of that line, there was not supposed to be any slavery. And so what the Kansas-Nebraska Act does is it opens up slavery, at least in terms of the Kansas territory. Now, this was extremely unpopular in Illinois, and in the way that people moved west, they tended to move horizontally. So the free states are going to move in horizontally west, and so they do not want to be competing against slavery. But of course, Southerners, they also want to move west too, and they want to bring their slaves with them. So this is the major conflict we have here. And so at his nominating convention for the position uh, as a Republican, this is when Lincoln gives his House divided speech. And one of the best excerpts from that speech is as follows: "A house divided itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do expect the House. I do not expect the House to fall, but I do expect it to cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Now, during the campaign, the candidates were speaking before a variety of audiences, but they were doing this separately. And so Lincoln's advisors approached Douglas and asked if they would be willing to debate in the closing months of the campaign. And so this is a map that shows you where the different debates between Lincoln and Douglas took place. The main issue dividing the two candidates was the problem of slavery. And by this time, slavery was a very heated issue throughout Illinois. Lincoln accused Douglas of being willing to extend slavery. He used his legal skills to maneuver Douglas into admitting that he cared very little about the social and moral issues involved in slavery. And Douglas charged that Lincoln's House divided speech was tainted with abolitionism and that Lincoln was fomenting discord and dividing the nation. Now, Lincoln did not argue that African Americans deserve the same political rights and social equality with whites, but he did argue that African Americans deserve the same natural rights as white men. He also charged that Douglas supported the Kansas-Nebraska Act, which repealed the Missouri Compromise of 1820, allowing slavery into the territories, thereby endangering the ability of white families to settle in the region and gain economic opportunities that were so essential for them to advance in society. Now, Lincoln does win the popular vote in Illinois, but he loses it in the legislature at a vote of 54 to 46. And at this time, legislatures are the ones who vote for who's going. So there's a popular vote, but the vote that really counts is the legislators. And so at this time, the legislatures are the ones determining who is going to be elected as senator. Now, Illinois plays a key role in the presidential election of 1860. Two of the most important candidates come from that state. Lincoln stayed in Springfield while the Republicans had their convention in Chicago. And at that time, it was not unusual for a nominee to not make an appearance at the convention, but to have his surrogates do that for him. He had a good deal of competition, but he was considered by many of them to be the most moderate candidate. And so Lincoln's Western credentials were promoted. He was referred to as Honest Abe, also as the rail splitter, because as a young man, he split logs to split rail fences. He was fairly moderate, and so he was very supportive of the containment of slavery, but was not openly opposed to slavery in terms of banning it. So he wasn't considered an abolitionist, but a moderate in that regard. So his moderate views made Easterners and Northerners believe that he was a candidate who could win swing states such as Illinois. Now, the Democrats had their own convention in Charleston, South Carolina, but they had a tough time choosing a candidate. Douglas hoped to be nominated, but when the question of secession came up, he was very courageous and said that he would not support any secession from the Union. And so he wanted to keep the Union together. The convention adjourned after voting to meet again in Baltimore on June 18th. And this is where Douglas after a number of ballots were cast, he finally won the nomination. However, the Southern Democrats were not happy, so they decided to walk out of the convention and they nominated their own candidate. And this would be John Breckinridge. Another group of disfranchised voters formed another party called the Constitutional Union Party, and they backed Daniel Bell. So this turns out to be a four-way race. And I have a map that shows you the four-way race here. And so you have Lincoln, Douglas, Bell, and Breckinridge all competing for the presidency. So Lincoln and Douglas, they receive the largest share of the popular vote, but Lincoln wins the Electoral College vote, and so he does win the election. Illinois, the state that went for Lincoln, also all the major offices were won by Republicans. So Republicans did very well in Illinois in the 1860 election. Richard Yates becomes governor of Illinois, and the party takes control of the legislature. Even though Douglas lost, he was determined to help Lincoln keep the Union together. He went back to Illinois to rally the state to support the Union cause, but he dies in June of typhoid fever. And this was a great loss of a pro-Union Democrat at the national level.